My pleasure to introduce my fellow panelists. Since you have a kind of program that gives their full credentials, a little bio, I'll just briefly mention their institution affiliations now. Peter Eleey, who is Associate Director for Programs and Exhibitions at PS1. Let's see who's here. Nancy Spector, who is Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the Guggenheim Museum, and soon to move to the Brooklyn Museum in a similar position. Massimiliano Gioni, who is Artistic Director of the New Museum and Director of the Trussardi Foundation in Milan. And Jessica Morgan, who is Director of the Dia Art Center. What is it? What do you call it now? Dia Art?
We've changed our name many times.
Yes.
Dia Art Foundation is
yes.
what we're with right now.
Okay. We'll go with Dia Art Foundation at the moment. I just want to start things off by asking the panel to reflect a little on the notion of orthodoxy in museum practice. The occasion of this panel and the subject, or this event, is the exhibition Unorthodox. Obviously, unorthodoxy is defined in relation, or thought about in relation to the Orthodox. So maybe we can just start off by talking about how you see what standard, accepted, traditional museum practice is, and if there is such a thing. Peter, maybe we'll go around.
I guess that, the first question that comes up is whether we're talking about kind of institutional, at the level of the institution's structure and function, the way Vasif was describing it, or, many of us are curators, most of us are curators, or at the level of the program, and I think we would answer those questions differently. I think at the level of institutional practice, probably one orthodoxy has to do with growth. I think there's just an assumption that all institutions have to grow. I don't think any museum director would be comfortable standing up and saying that they're satisfied with the level of the institution's physical structure, its program, its budget, beyond, say, some adjustments for the cost of doing business, let's say, over time, holding their budget relatively firm, their headcount firm, and just actually looking at other ways that the institution can change its work or improve what it does. That's one.
Nancy?
In thinking of Jens's exhibition and the topic of today's symposium, I thought about museums and the canon. We're all people who work in contemporary art, but the question of either establishing or validating or extending the canon that we know. And I think about that a lot as a curator of contemporary art, is what is the responsibility of an institution like the Guggenheim or perhaps PS1 MoMA? Are we there to discover new talent or provide a platform for just recognized talent? And that's something that I think Jens really tried to unpack in this exhibition in a quite interesting and provocative way.
Well, as a self-critical observation, I would say orthodoxy looks like this, and like all the people in the panel, and which is and I'm not saying it as a dismissal of the panel, but simply as an observation that orthodoxy is often placed where we least admit it to be, and I think it's the struggle between the orthodox and the unorthodox is based on accusing each other of being such. It's always like idolatry. It's always the other religion that adores the idols. Your own are the real ones, and I think something similar happens. All this is to say that obviously art, as any or many other forms of human expression, is based on a system of norms and conformity, and I think here we had different people who do different things, but all within an orthodoxy that I think we could speak for hours about, and I don't know even if that's so interesting or exciting. I think the reason why we are here is not because we are unorthodox, but sadly because we are orthodox within a field that we call contemporary art today. So I should leave it.
That's good.
I'm not sure I have a huge amount to add, but I would say that I really appreciated Vassiv's talk for moving towards the structural rather than the sort of minutiae of what's in or out of an exhibition. And I think you probably made most of the most salient points about how we've arrived at this point in time and the manner in which our sort of basis for understanding institutional development has resulted in this particular edifice of the museum at 300 years of age. So I don't think I can put it any better than you did, Vassiv. You did an amazing job.
So, I mean, one thing about orthodoxy, unorthodoxy is it's kind of a moving target. I mean, as museum practice, curatorial practice, institutional practice situations, environmental situations change, there is kind of what counts as advanced, progressive, avant-garde, whatever, sort of, as Jens was talking in the beginning, becomes more accepted, et cetera. But SALT and, Platform Guarantee as well, exemplify kinds of institutions that were developing sort of in the early years of this century and that have had profound effects, I think, or significant effects on more general museum practice. Clearly, he has a very different situation than a large museum with a large collection. But things such as hosting residencies, looking at exhibitions as part of broader programs of inquiry, things like this have tended to spread across more traditional kind of institutional practices. So I'm wondering if maybe we could talk a bit about ways in which sort of practice in small institutions, local institutions outside the centers has influenced sort of what goes on in kind of major institutions. If that is, seems to be a tenable thing to talk about. Yes, it does.
You can begin.
I mean, I don't know if I'm qualified to answer the question. I think what is happening actually in the orthodoxy of museums is that now there is an understanding that there is no such a thing as a center and a periphery. And, I think the paradox is to be discussing canonical issues or issues of orthodoxy and heterodoxy in a practice which, particularly at the moment, is based on notions of relativism in its most radical example. I think that, in a way, the problem of museums or a crisis of museum which we have witnessed from the 90s onwards has been how to adapt an institution that was built on the myth of excellence towards an age of relativism in which canon of excellences are relativistically defined. I don't know if this makes any sense. So the question of how does the periphery influence the center, I think, is less. I think large museums like the Met, like MoMA, Tate, are all based on a new narrative, which is the idea that there is no such a thing as a center, and there are multiple modernities, as Manolo Borja says, and so I think that, to a certain extent, is maybe the new orthodoxy. I think. Without wanting to be misunderstood, I think it would be interesting to think of what are the true unorthodox positions in relation to that model of museums. And in a way, again, for the sake of being a provocateur, I think I long for a certain kind of orthodoxy, of which maybe Dia is the last bastion, no? An idea of ideological, aesthetical position, which also, as I think, is more of a myth in itself, because Dia was also Andy Warhol, it was not just Donald Judd. But I think there aren't institutions out there that embrace a sort of code of behavior so desperately.
Yeah, I think what
to-
you've described, Massimiliano, though, is the way in which these larger organizations have absorbed the impact, influence of what you were referring to, Bruce, which is sort of having a direct relationship and then essentially absorbing or trying to eat or cannibalize these other locations, which I think is part of the problematic that Vasif was referring to, which is that it doesn't necessarily change the structure of the organization, but they just sort of, like some scary beast, begin to sort of morph into this accumulation of influences, and it has a detrimental impact, I think, on those smaller organizations, which certainly I feel very aware of in New York right now, that the smaller places that used to be such an important sort of vital part of the artistic spectrum here, and I'm just referring to not center periphery, but just within the location of the city, that there's been such a contraction in terms of the presence of that it's become very condensed, and that these specialisms are sort of eaten up by other organizations to some extent. I would say, certainly I love Tate. I worked there for 12 years, but I think we were very much part of that in London.
Just want to shift that.
Sorry, yes.
Just want to shift the focus slightly, because I think the way I heard the question was about the impact of activities of organizations such as SALT, which is incredible. But I also wanted to add that as a contemporary curator, I learn a lot, and I think many of us do, from artistic practices and how they are evolving. And many of the wonderful things that Vasif spoke about, of research platforms and changing temporalities of exhibitions, and this expanded notion of what constitutes the visual arts, that it's necessarily always moving toward the culminating moment of an exhibition, but rather a kind of ongoing investigation. And that, I think, is something that many museums are shifting and hopefully creating platforms for, or providing the resources for that kind of practice. And for me, I've learned a lot of that from artists, in addition to looking at what other organizations are doing. And I don't know if that's happened hand in hand, or I think we all learned so much from the artistic community. So I'm going to name names, but just that I heard places, but my first thought was there are artists who are shifting the gears too.
I think the place part, though, is still, I agree with everything you're saying. I think the challenge that we have, at least in the major centers like New York, is that we're often taking these practices or structures that are created in very specific contexts, usually with a very specific political address or function in mind, and undertaking them in whether it's London or New York or where have you, within institutions that for the most part operate, or we imagine, somewhat differently from those same political structures. So I think that's one of the big questions with, I think, any discussion of orthodoxy, at least in New York, is, what is our political function as institutions, or how do we even imagine that in the work that we do, and how we construct the institutions and perpetuate them? Because in almost every other place where one would go to sort of look at and experience these kinds of different functions, whether they're SALT, I think we're excited by a kind of realness of the relationship of those kinds of institutions and their programs to a locality of politics that we don't necessarily, I'll just speak for myself, feel in New York, in the connection between our institutions and the political construct in which we're operating.
I think maybe to pick up on something Jessica was saying, and to think about my own sense of sort of the landscape of museums in New York, or pretty much anywhere, is the increasing sort of disappearance within, let's take New York, of sort of kind of eccentricity, or in general, the increasing homogenization of kind of museum culture, I think, around the world. I mean, everyone clearly has, is presenting artworks that we view as unique, that in fact are unique. But in terms of when you look at institutions and the disappearance of certain kinds of things, I mean, just as a model of this, so it's obviously an odd case, I think of the Barnes Foundation, which was a truly unique and, in Philadelphia, outside of Philadelphia, a unique and very eccentric place that now has moved to Center City, Philadelphia, and though it's kind of recreated in kind of a theme parky way, it's permanent collection. It now is engaged in many of the activities that a standard museum is, which is contemporary art exhibitions, et cetera. And so I'm just wondering about the kind of diversity of museum practice and the pressures on institutions to become more like one another, certainly in a place like New York.
I concur entirely, Bruce. I mean, I don't think it's only here. I think, again, you know, the sort of rhetoric around the museum, the newness, the perpetual desire for newness, which equates generally with contemporaneity, which often seems to equate now with contemporary art, is a sort of pattern that we've seen repeated over and over again. And then it's also, I'm not sure if you were touching on this a bit, Vassif, but I mean the sort of desire to satisfy an audience whose constitution is not entirely clear, but it's the notion of a people that require a certain type of material, directional, interpreted experience, mediated experience, let's say. And I think that, you know, all of these self-imposed structures that we've sort of come to accept, and it comes back to sort of needing to question the structural organization of institutions, have resulted in this pattern, which I think, you know, having been gone from the US for 12, 13 years, it was much more apparent to me coming back here and realizing that many of the institutions that I was so familiar with when I previously lived here during the 1990s had disappeared or had somehow been erased in terms of their significance.
I don't know if I mean, there are some standards that I think many museums in New York follow and adapt to. On the other hand, I think it's I've become a bit suspicious of a rhetoric that places more honor on a certain type of peripheral institution and assumes that that's unorthodox and more critical. I think, you know, there is an orthodoxy of the alternative museums that has bored me to death. You know, the emphasis on process. I often joke, because I just had a baby, that it's the equivalent of somebody caring about the pregnancy but not about the child. And you know, I love my child and thank God the pregnancy was good, but you know, I want the child. The pregnancy is the means to get to the child. And so I think there is a rhetoric of a certain alternative or site specificity for its own sake. I don't care where the work is made, and I want to go where the work takes me. You know, I think there are a few sort of prepackaged assumptions that are the good practice, which are sort of mythologized as belonging to the alternative circuit, that I think are just as oppressive as the rhetoric of the Central American Museum being the bad guy, no? Maybe what I'm saying doesn't generate much sympathy, but I strongly believe that there is a canon of the alternative that is at this point as suffocating as the presumed canon of the big American museum.
Yeah, I would add there's a bit of a romanticization for a lack of resources, and I think there's it's very relative as to institutional size and access to. We're all struggling in a way, obviously at different levels, but I also think that I would disagree that the programming, we're using New York right now as our paradigm, that there's a certain sameness. I think that where we find sameness maybe is the museums need to have a restaurant and a gift shop and product and branding and things like that we're all falling prey to because of the need of attracting and sustaining audiences. Maybe that's not the correct way, and we'll all look back decades from now and think, why did we spend so much time and money on that? But I do think that the programming is pretty significantly different across, and it's wonderfully diverse in a way. If you go from Studio Museum, I know Thelma's going to be here, which does have artist residencies, and always has. It's the Studio Museum, to new museums focus exclusively on art of the present, and MoMA's incredible research. The Guggenheim just came off of this kind of very, I don't know, it was never actually decided in advance, but we did this intensive look at the 50s from a revisionist point of view for over a year and a half to 2 years, and it just kind of organically happened. So I think there's a lot of diversity in the programming. Where we're falling, I think, into the mode you're discussing is the all the external accoutrements, for better or worse.
Let's see. Wallace mentioned the notion of audience or constituencies, or however one wants to think about it, which is usually spoken of as kind of a monolithic entity. And I thought maybe you could speak a bit about how you see the audience of your institution, its structure or constituencies, how you look at who you're doing for what you were doing. Anybody on that?
I would say, one of the vast changes for me, going from Tate to Dia, is that in our various old documents, and we do follow it as an orthodoxy, is that we don't think about the audience. It comes very late in the conversation. We don't care how many people come. It's great when they come. But certainly none of the conversations about planning and thought about displays or the process behind exhibition making is really driven by the audience, and probably that is the fundamental structural difference that has allowed DIA to remain the way that it has over the many years. And that doesn't mean that we don't care about who those people are, and it doesn't mean that we don't do education programs and make sure that people who certainly wouldn't be able to go and visit Dia Beacon in the neighborhood of Dutchess County are brought to Dia. But these things do make an enormous difference. But
would you say at Tate, would you have conversations about audience at programmatic meeting? Like, would shows be chosen because of audience? And
no.
it's
yes,
yes,
absolutely.
and it was a open.
I would say it was.
It was not an elephant in the room, or it was openly discussed.
It was openly discussed. I would say even to the point of defining exhibitions by visitor numbers.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Wow.
I always thought that nobody actually confessed to that.
I'm no longer there, but I was.
Now you only confess because you left.
Yeah.
No, I think, going back to the orthodoxy, I'm sure in every curatorial meeting, nobody raises the hand and say this show is going to be a blockbuster or not. No, because I think it's in our own.
The way
it's in our own sort of.
No, the economic. I'm sure it's. I think probably most of the larger museums here would be lying if they did not confess that within your exhibition program you had to have, because of the way the structure was established with a certain amount of expenditure and reliance on these, I would be the first to say one could scale back and none of those pressures would be on, and maybe that's the right thing to do. But given the desire for the amount of program, there was a need, as I understand it at Tate. I was not responsible for balancing the books, but the pressure was such by the time I left. It certainly wasn't that way when I started 12 years before, which is interesting and maybe a discussion to have. But by the time I left, the pressure was such that there had to be 2 exhibitions that would bring in X number of people who would, by assumption, buy X number of cups of coffee and hopefully a catalogue and whatever else, And that was how the economics of the museum functioned, and with that, of course, comes a whole, slippery slope of other activity.
Yeah.
We mostly, I guess, as I think probably everyone else does too, we put a great premium at MoMA PS1 on programming for artists. We've spent years trying to draw just even a tiny portion of MoMA's audience to Long Island City. And it's a waste of time and resource. They're not interested in coming. It's too far. They have other things to do. It's a largely tourist audience, so they have to be at Abercrombie and Fitch afterwards, or, it's just adding another museum onto their days is is usually not what they want to do. And so, and we're also, we're part of the Cultural Institutions Group, which is a number of institutions, Brooklyn Museum, the Met. The Guggenheim is a CIG?
Not a CIG, but we're now doing that. Pass.
Oh, right, okay.
Okay.
Okay. So, but the Cultural Institutions Group, as I know it, is defined largely by occupying an institution that is in or on city-owned property. And as a result, because we get the property for free or almost free, we cannot charge mandatory admission. And that's a very big difference between us and MoMA, obviously. And in fact, we found in the last year and a half that there were still people who, we felt that there was yet a barrier to entry somehow, even with that. And so, we found a donor to underwrite for, free admission for New Yorkers. Of course, it's already, pay what you will, but that changed it for us in a different way because it allowed, we think this is what's happening. This is what we've heard from artists, is that, when they have studios in the neighborhood, they might come now multiple times a day. They'll drop in for 10 minutes or 20 minutes to see a work they like, they'll leave. But a lot of our audience is a kind of Brooklyn, North Brooklyn creative and artist community audience. And that said, we also lack the tools to really analyze and know that audience. We don't, we don't sort of profile people when they come in and track them very well. So we're sort of, in a way, not really working with, a full data set of, the zip codes that people come from. And likewise, we don't program with that in mind at all. I mean, we're lucky because admission represents relatively a small amount of money in our budget, so it's not something that we concern ourselves with.
Yeah, I think I was, and I'm glad you brought up artists as audience, because my question really was not so much about numbers as sort of kind of who makes up your audience, who you're thinking about. Not just the general public, a number of attendees, but rather, like, is there some kind of thinking about the audience that is kind of more complex than just like numbers of individuals who walk in the door?
Well, I can say empirically, my ideal reader, what Umberto Eco described as the imaginary creature that the text produces. My ideal reader is somewhere a combination of peers, artists, an audience that I think what distinguishes maybe the new museum and it makes it closer to DIA is that from the Guggenheim or MoMA is that I think the audience that comes to our institutions comes knowledgeably. I mean, as a interest in art and needs to know where that building is. We get very few people who stumble by accident or that find listed in the 10 things to do in New York. I mean, obviously the new building amplified that for a few years, and we probably still have a little bit of an effect of the sort of power of the architecture to announce the museum to a larger audience. But I think in the vast part, we are still an experimental museum, which means you have to know about art and contemporary art to go. You're not going to go just because it's part of a sort of rite of passage to come to New York and go there. And at the same time, that I think allow us to be certain small transgressions that maybe other museums cannot perform, and I think it's always a trade-off. You gain something, you lose, and it depends who you want to talk to. I mean, I'm glad that in many cases I talk to people who came because they wanted to. On the other hand, when I started working at the new museum, it was such a surprise for me because I mostly worked in biennals up to that point and more unconventional or less institutional settings or not museum settings, and I was shocked by how the new museum, which was meant to be young and new, actually, as all these our institutions probably welcome an incredible number of senior citizens who we should also keep in mind is an incredible force now in the cultural industry. And I say this again, half joking, but people who have time and money to spend are mostly senior citizens. And that I find is also particularly complex and perverse, because what myth of novelty and youth are we selling to whom? And
it's funny. I was very surprised when I started at DF. You'd asked me, obviously I had visited as a visitor, as a peer visitor, but if you'd asked me, I'm sure 6 months before I started working there, who would be the average, certainly Deer Beacon goer, I would have assumed that it would probably reflect our collection in terms of age and ethnicity, And in fact, it's not the case at all. And I've been very puzzled, of course, very happy, but also very puzzled by that. And we are now doing a lot more research about our audience, so that we had numbers already around age. Our biggest age group is 18 to 30, which I was flabbergasted by. And you can see it when you're up there. I mean, it's very evident. I think it's a very particular phenomenon around that experience of space and the contraction of space in other places, the relative ease of being able to get out of the city or adjacent cities if they're not coming from New York, although most of our visitors come from the New York area. It's very cheap. The train is relatively cheap. It's a whole day. It's it's something that is affordable, and it's an experience that's unlike a different type of museum experience, perhaps. But it was very surprising to me, and it was also very revealing because, maybe to refer back to your point, Bruce, if it might be a point, but the idea that one would try and program for an audience was kind of flipped by that. Was actually, if you show Donald Judd, Sola Witt, Agnes Martin, a lot of dead white people, you in fact get a very diverse, very young audience in our case, which seemed utterly surprising, but very interesting, I think, when all of us are second guessing, how do you bring in a different audience? The depressing thing is that in New York, with our now one open space where we've had Lamont Young and now Robert Ryman, I see the same type of audience that is wandering around Chelsea on a Saturday afternoon, which is the more predictable art audience. But so, how do you go about gauging these things? I'm not sure.
Just wanted to add that the Guggenheim thinks a lot about demographics. We do the exit surveys, and because the space is so monolithic, our audiences change according to exhibition quite often. So years ago at the Russian show, there were buses coming in from Brighton Beach, and you would hear Russian and Catalan. Strangely, Italians found themselves to see Maurizio Catalan's exhibition. So we have a lot of tourists because of the building, but then the content does drive. And it was what I just reacted to when Peter said CIG. We're not a CIG, but we participated. Now I think MoMA is doing it as well with if you buy, or not buy, you register for a New York City resident ID card, you get free admission to a number of museums. So they're no longer just the CIGs like the Met in Brooklyn. And it's been interesting because we were actually quite excited about the idea of reaching zip codes where people wouldn't necessarily pay $20 or $22 to come to see an exhibition at the Guggenheim. And I think we've been a bit disappointed lately that it's not the far-flung neighborhoods that we're grappling with. How do we extend our viewership to a more diverse audience? And it seems that it's really people from the Upper East Side who have their cards, who are coming to the Guggenheim, who could be members.
For free now.
For free. Or they could be members. So we have to do some more work for outreach, but that is not a great success.
Well, you mentioned the New York City card, and that kind of initiative was really picked up on by Tom Finkelpearl, who's head of the Department of Cultural Affairs, one of whose main concerns is the lack of diversity among museum staff. And, we spend a lot of time talking about diverse audiences and not as much about kind of internal staff. And I'm just wondering if you see sort of any discussion within your institutions of that, or concerns of your own around those issues, other places you've worked. Nancy's about to move to a completely other institution.
Yeah, it's something we certainly discuss but haven't done much about. it also depends how you define diversity.
Right,
And for
right.
me, empowering women has been very, very important, and making sure that women have leadership roles at major institutions. So that's been a personal quest of mine, and moving to the Brooklyn Museum, it's kind of solidifying that, working with Ann Pasternak. Questions of other kinds of diversity, it's huge. It's a real problem for, I think, most of our cultural institutions. I mean, Thelma will be here later, and I think she will address that in her amazing way. But I think it's something we all need to think about. And from the root, art history programs and museum training programs, and how do we attract talent and enable people to move up through the system and have a voice that's essential.
Well, we have a lot of knowledgeable people here and people engaged in museum practice on their own here, and I'd like to open this up for questions. Vasif, do you want to come up as well? Because Jens was saying that we should have some, exactly, we should broaden our panel. Yeah.
Yeah. Why don't you go back there?
Oh, Seth.
Hi, Bruce. It's Seth Rodney. I wanted to ask the panel, in terms of thinking about your audience, how much is there a kind of conversation that goes on between the curatorial side and the press and marketing side? Because it's my sense from having written about museums, most of my writing is in hyperallergic. And I've studied museums, specifically Tate Modern. But my sense of the sort of ways that museums across the pond and here work is that a lot of the audience research is taken up by marketing. And then there's I think a conversation that happens before exhibitions are mounted about sort of what the expectations for audience are. So if you could talk about what your relationship, what you think your relationships are between the curatorial side and the marketing side, that would be helpful.
I think it's a case by case. I mean, we don't, at the New Museum, even have exactly a marketing department. And, Vasif first was saying, I don't know if such titles will get through the development department. The development department at the New Museum has no saying in the programs, and they just go out and thank God, look for the money for the shows we need to do. I think again there is a bit of a assumption that American museums are driven by development, and I mean I don't know. I just look at the big.
Yeah, no, it's just
big guys just to tease them, but probably not even at MoMA is like that, or nobody even at MoMA would confess that I don't think, really, I think it's a naive understanding that the development brings the, I mean, they might force you to have a subtitle, or in some museums, I don't know, we don't even have subtitles in our shows either, so I think it's really a case by case, and on the other hand, I would be naive if I were to say that if I were to do 10 consecutive shows and nobody comes, I would probably be fired and there would be nothing wrong about it,
In all the years I've been at the Guggenheim, there's been no discussion from the marketing side. However, this year there's been a little bit of a shift because we had a year with 3 exhibitions, Encore Silence, The Trauma of Painting, and Zero.
Way to go, guys.
The curators were asked to think about something a little more descriptive or uplifting. So we ended up with How to Work Better. So.
I can perhaps speak to Tate, although I'm not sure how well. I mean, I think there definitely was a presence for marketing in some exhibitions, but I think I would say that was very much limited to those that were expected to reach very high-level audience numbers. And for whatever reason, I was rarely involved in those exhibitions, so maybe it didn't impact me so much. There was one occasion, which I've never forgotten actually, where a title of mine, for a brief period of time, we had a group of people who were authorizing titles at Tate, and they did insist on changing the title of my exhibition, for which I never forgave anyone. But it was a very short-lived period. But yeah, it's a very different thing at DIA because we're a tiny team anyway. So differentiating between departments is hard to even do because we all wear lots of hats. But I think perhaps, I'd need to reflect back on that history at Tate a little bit more. But I think perhaps it was that different to U.S. museums, perhaps even. Maybe there was a little bit more infiltration into decision making. I'll have to think about that.
Can I ask a really specific question? I guess your last show, the Great Pop Show, Global Pop Show, I struggled with the title at the beginning because I didn't understand the sort of, rather than the subtitle, I guess the pre-title. That was the name of the sponsoring company?
Oh, the EY thing.
Yes,
Oh my
I'm just
God,
curious.
it's so terrible. Yes, sorry. I mean, that was, yes.
Because I don't think that's ever
No, I'm
happened
glad
in the
you
U.S.
bring that up.
I'm just
Yes, no, Peter, that was really, I must say, a deeply shocking thing that was explained to me by our development team. There was a sponsorship from Ernst & Young. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think it's a really great example of how these things can be treated in such different ways. Ernst & Young sponsored a number of exhibitions that took place at Tate, and I think there might even be another exhibition under that series. The first was Clay, the EY exhibition.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah.
The what?
So they somehow, or rather, somebody in our development team agreed to a contract wherein there was the concession that every exhibition would have EY for Ernst & Young before every exhibition. And apparently this was a humongous mistake on behalf of the person in the development team, and we had to live with this thereafter. But I mean, it was,
Right.
terrible. I mean, it was humiliating, really. I had worked with a graphic designer for weeks and weeks to try and massage it into the cover of the book. But yeah, I think that's a very egregious example. And when I started, I also noticed very much, actually, at that point, moving from the States back to the UK, that the branding that we had on exhibition marketing was much more evident than anything. I mean, I worked at the ICA Boston. We didn't have it, like we were so lucky to get a corporate sponsor. It was like in our dreams, but there was no concession to that type of desire for presence. I mean, definitely, we don't do anything like we have no donor recognition at DIA at all. We sometimes joke that it's in Braille somewhere on the floor, but I think that is a really big difference, actually. I'm going to have to think about all this much more, but it's peculiar because, in fact, I'm sure the amounts as well are much less, for much more presence, But
You mean at Tate?
the amount given, I think, is probably actually less than is received in U.S. institutions from sponsorship. But I'd have to look at that a little bit more. But I'm pretty sure that I feel confident in saying that. But,
Okay, I just want to follow up on that. I'm curious about, specifically within the context of New York institutions, because obviously the economic situation being quite different in either in the UK or in other parts of the world. I'm just curious, what would constitute, in your minds, an unorthodox approach to the funding structures of such institutions?
Sorry, in New York?
Yeah, within New York. What would constitute an unorthodox approach to funding of institutions?
I think this is already becoming a big...
From every person.
Yeah, I think it's already becoming quite an issue. I'd have to refer again back to my Tate experience, because at DIA we really have so little interaction with anyone apart from at DIA. It's really individually based, and the demands tend to be very, very different and actually remarkably free of any controls at all. But I think increasingly sponsorship from corporations has come with a demand for a programmatic angle, and that was very clear to me. Particularly, I can go into details of names, but many companies now have their own arts programs, and so the arts that they sponsor within institutions have to be in alignment with their own interpretive strategies or particular thematics, let's say, speed. But
I think, just to sort of play devil's advocate on the other side of it, one thing. I mean, we have a number of people involved, I think with all of our museums who are from the worlds of private equity or hedge funds or investing or what have you, in which value skyrockets from zero at the beginning to something astronomical when success happens. And I've talked to a couple of people involved with us about whether we could find a funding structure where actually small grants of equity were made into a central fund somewhere at the museum, rather than chasing the money after it's been made. Maybe there's a way to chase the money before it's been made. And I don't know. I think there's a lot of other tax and legal issues that come to bear on that question. But I mean, that's, say, the opposite end of a public subsidy question is, I don't know. That's one way. Or we could also, sell art.
Yeah, that's I think the ultimate.
Right.
It's on? Yes. Hello. My name is Cristina. I'm an artist, architect, and writer of cultural programming. And I wanted to point two cases referring what Václav was saying about, that the middles or the peripheries are disintegrating towards a more homogenization of the art world. I think all those are conditions of hyper-capitalism. It not only happens in the art world, but we can see it in fashion or any other, like market today. But I wanted to talk or to ask, there's two points I would like for you to discuss. One is, like someone was talking the other day, how the gallery world, for example, which is not discussed here today, but it's turning toward a much more, how do you call that? Like fierce art market strategies where blue chip art is one that is being sold and sought after, and maybe museums, institutions are doing what our galleries should do, which is promote young artists, and are doing much more programs, and as the institution in Turkey, or many resident programs, or things that were not so proliferate before now are much bigger. And I wonder if the art institution, not so much the gallery world, is taking over that part. And also I would like for you to talk about the Whitney, the new museum, because it enters in a new logic of this touristic operation, which is all that developing area of the Mid-Parking district, and it's the last piece of an operation that closed a very well thought political, urbanistic, and economical operation. But at the same time, I believe it's a very successful museum, almost like a post-Beaubourg museum, learning by maybe the utopias and the young ideas of 40 years later, but trying to adapt them to today realities of the hyper-capitalism and the New York world and tourism economy and all those things we've been discussing today. Thank you.
Any response?
Scott's on the next panel.
Yeah, exactly. Scott can answer
The
that.
gentrifier.
Yeah, maybe I'm gonna.
Hello, my name is Jason Wallace, and having this discussion about orthodoxies is some of it's structural, and then other is cultural, and some of the things that come to mind without oversimplifying the ideologies is John Cage, A Lesson for Students and Teachers in terms of a hierarchy, how he creates a certain amount of flow between the teacher and the student in terms of the benefits that both of them are getting. And that's something that kind of comes up in listening to this conversation is, what is the flow and the conversations? I understand that decisions are made off of data, but what data? Is it the data from just spreadsheets, or is it data that's coming from actual dialogic conversations?
But at the new museum, I think from my experience, but also working on other shows, I can't say I ever chosen anything based on data. So I don't know if maybe I'm doing anything wrong, but we don't get, we have a vague idea of who the audience is, but we don't get a breakdown of statistics or, actually, that's when I get suspicious, when museums sort of conform to an idea of audience that belongs to other industries. I think it's time to get a little suspicious. And obviously some museums maybe do it. I hope not all of them, and I hope many don't. But I don't know how to answer the question, because data doesn't play any role in our decision making. I think what drives our decision making is mostly to make exhibitions that you wouldn't see if it wasn't us doing them. That's like a simple way to describe what we do it, and with the belief that somehow those exhibitions feel necessary at that moment in time, and therefore people will come, more or less people and different types of people, but that might be the reason why we are a smaller institution, but because we don't think that strategically about data and how data can be used to produce audiences. I think, this ghost of the audience or the invention of the public is somehow slightly paranoid. I think we should also remember that good institutions produce audiences. It's not the audience that produce the institution. And I don't know if that was the question, though.
Slightly, but it's more to address like diversity.
Mm-hmm.
In regards to even wanting to have certain conversations. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Well, I'm curious, since we talk about audience, Vassiv, could you talk a little bit more about how about how you think about sort of Saul's position? I mean, you had kind of alluded to this earlier in your talk, but I mean, it's a very different kind of thing than
This
large
particular question.
institutions. Yeah.
I mean, this particular question.
Well, or this question and also,
I mean, the data question is a bit complicated for me. One is, there has to be certain protocols in place. One is if I'm collecting this data has to be made public, first of all. I can't keep it to my own. That would be extremely selfish, and actually it's actually not ethical. Or if I'm collecting data, they also have to collect data on me as an institution. I don't know how that can be done, but conceptually it could be possible. Secondly, it's kind of the generalization of this data collecting. I don't know what it would contribute. We do not collect any information on people who come in the door. Not because we're not interested, but we're not interested in abstracting it into percentages and pie charts and kind of creating, and we're not interested in creating a system of efficiency. After that, you say, okay, this percentage, okay, I must be more to the people between 45 and 55. This is not so interesting. But for specific projects, that could be quite valuable and quite important. But I'm more interested in, which is the impossible thing, is getting in the heads of people who are actually coming in and going out, and what they're thinking, how their lives are changing, how are they responding. And the more important thing is to kind of create these tools, and with this response, should people want to respond? Should they want to, return to the institution with some kind of reaction? How to make that a possibility. I mean, early on, certain social media things and et cetera, was kind of making that possible, but it's completely changed these days. That's not a possibility anymore. I don't know. There could certainly be incredibly sophisticated and intelligent ways of looking at it, but what I want is, if someone is coming in and giving a response and taking that response serious, then perhaps taking it into a kind of a co-production over time. We had people who criticized us on the web and etc. and other places. I would invite them, have a conversation. There are those bloggers who are now giving exhibition tours, critical exhibition tours. We have this thing called critical exhibition tours, which means people do come and critique the exhibition and we come and listen to the critique as well without any of our input or control or etc. etc. But we also give an honorarium for this. But this is just part of the gestural aspect of it. In terms of yeah, I mean, I think the input. I mean, it wouldn't be. It wouldn't be excellent. It would not be an excellent idea to generalize on the model of Tate and apply it to the whole world, as if all institutions in the world are acting like Tate in terms of development department's role in yeah. They overstep their boundaries, obviously. I mean, we had a collaboration years ago with Tate, and I remember this being the case. I think American institutions are much more subtle, and they have different standards and better standards in terms of how they work, how the curatorial and development works. When we're starting the institution, we made a grave mistake, I think, is that I was able to consolidate the programs, exhibitions, research, web, social media, etc., so all under one roof. But this consolidation did not include fundraising, development, and press. And we suffer from this because in an ideal world, when you're setting off a project, everybody has to be on the table. So you don't take a project to your fundraising and say, you know, I have this, you know, here's the exhibition, here's the project, here's everything about it, now go and start working on it. This doesn't work. And then it's basically kind of giving a package which is already, you act more intelligently than your colleagues, which is not a good thing. This intelligence has to flow in the institution. So now we're looking at ways of actually consolidating everything under one roof, so that we don't no longer contribute to this malaise that we actually not only inherited but also reproduced. The institution is a totality, and within that totality, I don't think there should be, not even between these kinds of more administrative departments, this kind of rupture. And yeah.
I think we have to.
I just wanted to.
And now? No. Okay, yes, one more question.
This is on. Well, all of the institutions that you're representing on the panel, in one way or the other, could be understood as unorthodox. DIA started out with a really incredible radical idea of just focusing on a very small group of artists that were collected in depth and were supported for a long period of time. The new museum obviously came out of the desire to create an alternative museum. The Guggenheim is perhaps more of a classic institution, but when I look at the programming, I see that there is definitely the ambition to open doors, and I want to refer to specifically to the incredible projects that I've seen coming out of the global initiative. For example, the exhibition that Pablo León de la Barra recently did, really bringing in artists into a sphere like the Guggenheim from parts of the world that really haven't been explored enough in the United States. And of course, PS1 as sort of like the grandmother of all alternative spaces, with very radical programming, with very innovative programming, really one of the first museums or institutions to bring in residencies and sort of like expand programming beyond the white cube. So when I listen to you, and I feel like, yeah, maybe everything is sort of actually very unorthodox, but then at the same time, I don't know, do we actually have an impact beyond the walls of our museum, or are we just sort of like all within a little sphere, in a little bubble, where we are within that context unorthodox, but beyond that, what is really the impact that we have? And I know I'm romantic, perhaps overly ambitious, and maybe also a little naive when I ask this question, but how can we break through those barriers or boundaries that the museum's wall represent, and really have an impact that goes beyond this sort of very small circle of the art world?
Hi, Jens, sorry. What sort of impact are you looking for museums and other institutions to have exactly, Jens? Because I've asked these questions as well. It's not only about impact, but what sort of impact are you looking for out there in the so-called world? Because the institutions are also embodiments of that outside, so to speak. They're not outside of the outside. They're embodiments of it as well. So the question, I think, has to go further. What sort of impacts are we talking about in terms of generating audiences, so to speak, or constituencies, which has been addressed as well? Are we talking about museums as incubators of some broader social, political, ideological transformation? What do we mean by hegemonic, which is the word we heard earlier quite a bit, or counter-hegemonic? So that's, I would ask, what do you think the museum is there to actually transform out there, particularly if the museum within itself can't really transform very much? And I would also say, definitely Jens is correct. Listen, my first experience of DIA was with a discursive context of amazing discussions in the 1980s that Charles Wright organized, group material, democracy, with PS1, with the artists' residency, so on and so forth. So these are institutions that actually began with strong discursive programs, that are kind of so-called alternative institutional models, which have now been largely absorbed by larger museums and institutions, right? That's part of the tension as well. Sorry.
I would very much like to answer your question, but I thought perhaps, is this okay? I mean, I'm not trying to escape. Okay, good. I planted Joshua here to do this.
I mean, I think I don't want to sound too narrow-minded, but I do believe that I can only be an expert in one field. And I think the issue of expertise is relevant to museums, even though we don't speak so much about it. So I cannot be an expert in organizing unions or have an impact on the economy and in the choice of artists. And I'm not saying this as a justification. I'm saying that my impact needs to go through the artworks that are chosen and presented. And would I inspire as a day-to-day transformative experience in the museum? I inspire that people come and find themselves in a place where time and attentions are handled differently than out there. So where time is spent without an immediate purpose to a certain extent, or without an immediate accountability in terms of attention and money, basically. You know, the Svetlana Alpers, I think, in the famous essay about the museum effect, she says, the museums is the place of attentive looking. And to me, that would be a transformation. You know, if I can have exhibitions in which people come and for the 2 hours, 3 hours, you know, in my shows there is always so much to read because I want people to stay as much as possible and somehow forget the use of time that they have outside the museum. And maybe it's a very modest ambition for what a museum should be, but I think it's, I cannot pretend that, you know, my museum or our exhibitions will change the minimum wage in New York, and maybe it's not even my job. You know, I think also a certain idea of activism through museum is, to me, dead, or it's a representation of activism. It's not. You know, there was a great Italian intellectual whose name was Elio Vittorini, and he says that art should not play the fiddle to the revolution. You know, art is I think, imparts change through a linguistic change. And maybe that's my limit, but it's at least the limit within which I know I'm competent. And I think it's a little too easy to pretend to be competent in every other field.
Add to that, not to disagree, but I think of my practice as creating on a kind of micro level, where if I can, through exhibitions like in 1995, the Felix Gonzalez Torres exhibition, or the Tino Segal project in 2009, change people's minds about or ask certain questions, or what can art do, what can art mean, is this art, what does it mean to me, just really on that granular level that's both personal and political. These are certain artists that I tend to work with. And I think I'm agreeing with Massimiliano is that you can't really do necessarily more than that, but that's a lot. And it was just last week at the Brooklyn Museum on a panel, Martha Rossler said, art cannot make revolution, people do. So if you can get to people, and even if it's a small number, who have had that experience in your show, or a show, that's going to carry that message or those questions on, then I feel like we've done something. And that's where I feel art is in that important liminal state of changing minds.
I would really come back to where we began with this change, or potential lack of difference. I mean, for me, I think the sustained culture of difference within these institutions is incredibly important. It's why DEAR is certainly important to me. Like you, I was also introduced to DEAR when I lived here through its discursive program, which at that time felt unmissable. It was extraordinary, but it was what also led me to visit the Earth Room for the first time, and to feel that is still an incredibly important work, along with the other permanent present works that we maintain, seems a very essential part of what DEAR is. The different temporalities, permanence, permanent presence, as Heine would say, one of our founders, to the long-term displays that we maintain, whether it's in exhibitions which last for years, or the displays that last for years, but then alongside that, a very contemporary discursive program, which I would be the first to say is perhaps lapsed, although with James Meyer starting now, the two of us are very keen to revive. Although I think the program has lived on in a very intensive way in producing a group of people who attend, whether it's our poetry readings or the Artist on Artist talks, which is a very particular, small, albeit small, and that's fine, you know, group of people who have a active conversation with each other. For me, that role, understanding the distinctiveness of that role and maintaining that distinctiveness is very important, and not succumbing to the pressure to constantly renew, become new, add. You know, I think the component parts are really quite phenomenal. It's about maintaining a relevance, perhaps, with that most contemporary element, which is the critical discourse at DEAR.
I guess interesting, I think, when Max was talking about expertise. I mean, I found myself having to become an expert in some ways, in a very rudimentary way, on labor politics this year, because our art installers and our maintenance staff elected to organize themselves. And so began about 6 months of a very interesting discussion about, you know, what that meant, how they understand their jobs, how we understand their jobs, how they actually come together to make many of the core aspects of what the public experiences at the institution. And that is, at least I think for us as a staff, was an interesting experience, because it brought us back to the how of what we do, which I also think is a big part of it. It's a big part of it for me. I think, you know, I understand my expertise so narrowly that I'm part of why I work in institutions is because I like having to work outside that area of expertise and invite other people into that. And I think when we're thinking about the way that art functions, I mean, historically it was the promise of the future being better, you know, that something, the next thing was going to be better than what we have. And of course, you know, there's a whole history of how that played out, which, you know, we call art history. And I think at larger institutions, but also in the smaller, more contemporary, or even narrowly historical ones like DEAR, that we all work at, we're, you know, our institutions are models for institutions out in the world. That's why I work at one. And I think that to the extent that we can embrace those power dynamics that I think people are struggling with beyond the cultural sphere and reflect them back and also try to unpack them and improve them, you know, we're doing a great service. That means, I think, being able at a place like MoMA to tell the story that is the story that you know, all of us have learned over the years is a problematic one, and buffet it from all sides, trying to, you know, make clear what those problems are and invite other people, you into those going forwards. I think it has to be what Vasif mentioned at the beginning, sort of the Chantal Mouffe quote about institutions really being a place of contestation, that we don't fundamentally know what they are, that they're places where we, I think, have to emphasize and cling to, the authority that the institution has, even as we want it to become more porous, less authoritative, and more responsible in some ways to the larger cultural context in which we're operating.
Great.
Well, thank you very much to everyone on the panel. We are going to meet again in 10 minutes to hear Caroline Christoph Bakayev and then follow with the second panel. So we have a bit of a break. But thanks again to all our speakers.
Good coming out. Good positive note.